Hello and welcome to Yesterday's Airlines. Today we are talking aerospatial BAC Concordes, a type which has been largely ignored in 400 scale for many years. You get the odd release here and there from Gemini, but they're very infrequent and everyone seems to have forgotten about the world's most famous supersonic jetliner. Now, these four Concordes that you can see in front of you are recent purchases from Aviation Retail Director store in the UK, who've commissioned some exclusives using a mould which isn't particularly well known in 400 scale, but has been used a few times before. So in this video, what we're going to do is check out these Concordes and also get a comparison of this Concorde mould to the existing Concorde moulds, see which ones I think are best, where they're good, where they're bad, and all of that stuff. So that's what we're going to get into in this video. But it is not the case that Aviation Retail Direct have sponsored this vid. No. I purchased these with my own money and they weren't cheap, let's be honest. But the sponsor of this video is actually Northeast Diecast. So don't forget to check out Northeast Diecast because they have an amazing range of 400 scale models, plus a lot of 200 increasingly, and they've got some really cool models there at the site. And when you check out Northeast Diecast, don't forget to use the code Yesterday's Airlines 15 for 15% off your order at Northeast Diecast, because that makes a massive difference. So Yesterday's Airlines 15 will get you 15% off your order at Northeast Diecast. Also, don't forget to chuck a like on the vid here and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We're getting a lot of content up here on the channel and I think it's pretty good stuff, so I hope you do too. Chuck a subscribe on and like the vid. But let's get on and check out these four Concordes and compare them to other Concordes in 400 scale. We'll start with having a look at the packaging, and here we've got one of the releases, G-BOAA, and you can see they come in these slightly unusually shaped boxes that fit the Concorde, but have a nice flip top lid. And this particular model also has a bit more information on the inside flap. The others don't have that, but you can see the aircraft is in the plastic cradle there, and the box is very nice, and it's an official licensed product. Aviation Retail Direct really do keep their BA license very close and are very aggressively defending that. But it's good because they're releasing some models, at least, unlike other people who have licenses don't necessarily release them. But you see we've got all four of the 5 releases actually that they put out. We've got the 4 different liveries. We've got the BA Landor here. Previously, you just saw we had the British scheme from the early 80s, and then we've got the Chatham Dockyard scheme, which was put on in that wheeltail era from 97 onwards. So they're the 4 of the 5 releases that I've got. There's also another Chatham Dockyard version out there. So now let's unbox one of these and get a closer look. We'll start with the oldest of the models from a historical perspective, and that's G-BOAA, the first Concorde delivered to British Airways, and she's wearing the full Nagus scheme with the long British Airways titles. Now, this mould is not a new mould, as I have already mentioned. In fact, this mould is a mould which first appeared kind of around that 2017 mark. There had been an earlier version of this mould that existed, and that mould was being used by Socatec, a French store which has for a long time produced French models and often has used Gemini molds in the past. But around 2012 they put out some Concordes which didn't look particularly great, I have to admit. They had a rather blunt nose and the detailing wasn't particularly nice. But in 2017 the mould reappeared, revitalised, much better all over, with much nicer casting and a pointier nose. And they put out a couple of Air France versions, 2018, 2020 sort of time, and I got both of those, and they're both really superb models. And that is the mould which is being used here. And it's not just being used for these British Airways versions, because Socatec, who've now rebranded themselves apparently as One Bird, they've also got some Air France versions out which represent various Air France Concordes that are currently on display at Sinchheim, at Le Bourget, at Toulouse and at Washington. So they've got 4 different versions out themselves to go quite nicely with these British versions. But in this video, I've only got the British ones. I've already had those 2 previous and rather nice Air France Concordes. But that is the background on the mould. So it is a mould which I believe is owned by Socatec. The models are made in the Aviation 400 factory, but the mould is owned by Socatec and it's been licensed for these BA exclusives for ARD, but also One Bird, which was Socatec, has used it for some Air France examples too. So about the only aircraft you could ever really mistake a Concorde for is the Tu-144, and frankly, even that doesn't look particularly similar. It's got this really remarkable shape to it, and obviously also has that droop nose configuration. Here you can see this BA version on landing, and the nose is fully drooped. There's an intermediate setting as well, plus you had the nose up with the visor up and the nose up with the visor down. So there are 4 different settings, and nobody has made those settings in the 400 scale mold, and this mold repeats that. It does not have the distinctive different visor settings and nose configurations that the Concorde can have, and it is being designed, as you can see here, with the nose and the visor up, which is the way the aircraft was typically parked, and also the way the aircraft was operated during cruise mode. But you can see here that this mold has got a really nicely pointed front to it. You can see it's also got an aerial fitted there, which is one of the first times that Concorde's ever had that. You can see that it's a seamed mold, which isn't surprising considering the way the wings attach, but the seam is very discreet. I must say that I'm not overly thrilled by that nose gear leg. It's got a great length to it, which is nice, but the detailing isn't particularly fabulous. Having said that, the main gear is much better and has quite a nice look to it, as does the wing and those wonderful Olympus engine nacelles, which have a really good shape and look very impressive. Turning her up onto her back so you can see the underneath, you can see that it's got some good flap, well, technically they don't have flaps, elevon detailing, because the Concorde doesn't actually have flaps, and you can see again the nacelles there nicely squared off, looking rather good. And when we turn her over, you can see that something else which is molded in on this version of the mold are those long antenna fairings atop the fuselage. Both of those are molded in, which is rather good. Moving to the back of the wing from the top, it's got some really good detailing on the elevons and obviously on the engine exhausts as well. So I'm really liking a lot of the detailing on this mold. And at the rear, we've got the little tail bumper wheel. That, not spectacular, I have to admit. And I must say that the tail doesn't join the fuselage that spectacularly either. It could perhaps be a little bit tighter, but otherwise a really nice form. And I think that this Concorde mold looks really good from pretty much any angle. You can see from above that it's looking really nice, and equally from the underside as well, where there's actually an impressive amount of print detailing, as you probably noticed. So really liking the overall look and feel of this updated Socatec mold, and I think that it's a very nice Concorde overall. Looks great from the front, and one of the things I think the mold has got well down is that the nose gear gives the aircraft a slightly tail down stance because it's tall, which is exactly the way the Concorde looked. So I think that it's a great representation of Concorde in 400 scale, and I guess the question is, how does it compare to the other Concorde molds that are available in the scale today? Now, before we get to comparing this to the other versions that are available in 400 scale, let's get out the other editions and have a look at those. So we've got the British livery from the early 80s, and this aircraft is registered G-BOAA Alpha Echo. Basically the same scheme as the original Negus, just with those modified, enlarged and shortened titles, which didn't last that long. There was some controversy about British Airways trying to trademark the British. I think British Air Ferries got rather grumpy and started painting their Viscounts up with big British titles. Then, of course, we've got probably the best scheme, in my opinion, on a Concorde, and that is the iconic Landor scheme from the mid-80s, and here we've got the aircraft GB0 Alpha Charlie. The Landor scheme is the scheme that the aircraft wore through most of my childhood, and when I went to Heathrow, I'd see Landor Concordes. And even though the Landor could often look quite dark in overcast British weather, on the Concorde with the brilliant white, it always looked really, really good. So very pleased with that version of the model, especially because Landor Concordes have up till now been actually surprisingly difficult to get hold of in 400 scale. Okay, the fourth scheme is probably not my favorite. Well, it's definitely my least favorite, I think, of all of these liveries, and that is the Chatham Dockyard. It just is kind of lacking something. I quite like the new Speed Mark, but I much preferred the Landor colours. And anyway, regardless of that, the aircraft that we have here is GB0 Alpha Bravo. So that's 4 of the 5 Concordes. They've also made GB0 Alpha Delta in the Chatham Dockyard colours as well. Now, when we're looking at different Concorde moulds in 400 scale, the granddaddy of Concordes in 400 scale is obviously the Gemini Jet Concorde. It is easily the most used mould. It's been used not just by Gemini, but also Phoenix have made some fantasies on it. Black Box did too. There's been a variety of JC, but mainly Gemini releases covering all the usual candidates. And it's a perfectly solid and good Concorde. But in my view, it is a little outdated, and I personally prefer the look of the newer Socatec version. I think that the nose is slightly pointier, and I always thought that the nose gear on the Gemini has some really nice detailing on it, but is a little bit too short, as we'll see later on in the video. You can see that the seam line at the wings is in a slightly different position on the Gemini. It finishes earlier right by the gear, but that does mean that where the wings join to the fuselage, it's not quite as gracefully done. It's a little difficult to see here, but when you have the mould in hand, it's not quite as nice. But then again, the seam is slightly better hidden. So, as is always the case with different moulds, it's a little bit swings and roundabouts. Something which is missing from this old Gemini mould are both of the rooftop antenna fairings there, which are moulded in on the new Socatec version. They're usually just printed on the Gemini as needed. Also, as I pointed out earlier, the Socatec comes with main gear landing doors, which look very nice. And that is, again, something which is missing on the Gemini Jets mould, which doesn't have any main gear doors. That's quite a large issue for me, I think, and something they could probably improve quite easily, but they never got around to it. But then again, they don't actually make many Concordes. I think the last one was made in 2020, and there was one in 2017. There were very few Concordes in recent times. Looking at the rear of the Gemini is pretty solid. It's got a decent little tail bumper and a very tight seam on that tail fit there, which is both good. I'd say that the tail bumper on this Socatec mould is pretty much the same. Neither of them are great, but I do think the Gemini has a better vertical stabilizer join to the fuselage. So, broadly, they're both pretty good, but I personally think that the nose, the height of the nose gear, which you can see here when you put both of them side by side, the addition of the aerials, the main gear doors, these aspects attract me more to this new Socatec version than to the old Gemini. But the old Gemini is perfectly reasonable and middling Concorde mould, I would say, but personally it doesn't quite have the finesse and look that I'm going for a Concorde. But it is not the only Concorde available in the scale, because there is another, and that is the Herpa mould, which has been in line for many years. Now, forgive the state of this model. My Herpa Concorde took a long fall off of a shelf and landed nose first a few years ago. But they're super rare, so I've never been able to replace it. And you'll see the nose gear got broken. But broadly, this has been lionized as the best Concorde mould for many years in the scale. And frankly, it shares an incredible amount with the Socatec mould, so much so that you might even think that they're copies of each other. But in some ways, they are different, and in some ways that makes the Herpa slightly better. The nose, the shape of the nose, ignoring the fact this model is a little bit broken up, is pretty largely the same. The main difference from a fuselage and wing perspective is that the wing seam, although it looks almost the same, is slightly different on the Socatec. It curves in a little bit more. From the bottom, it looks largely the same, but when you have them side by side, there is a minor curve shape difference there. One is convex and one is concave on the fuselage. From the underside, though, they look pretty much the same, and this is what's making me think that, you know, one is largely derived from the other. That's not a bad thing because, as I say, the Herpa is very well thought of, albeit it's been very poorly used in 400 scale. I think the last release was more than 15 years ago now. You can see that both of these moulds have very similar rear portions. They both got main gear with doors, though the gear is different on each one. They've both got those rooftop fairings. I have to say that when you look at some of the detailing on the Herpa, it is a little bit better. They both got the similar issue with the vert stab fitting into the fuselage, but you can see that the tail bumper on the Herpa has much better detailing than that on the Socatec, so that is definite improvement. In fact, the other place where there is also that improvement is at the nose gear. Here's some photographs of my Herpa Concorde before it took a long dive off of a tall shelf. And you can see that the nose gear before it was broken is much better detailed than that on both the Gemini or the Socatec. So from that perspective, I think that the Herpa mould probably does have the edge over these new Socatec versions because the undercarriage is slightly better detailed across the board. The rest of the mould is effectively the same for practical purposes, except these Herpas are old enough they don't have aerials fitted. So when you look at them, for example, underneath here, you really can't tell any dramatic difference. And it does make me think this Socatec mould was effectively derived from the Herpa, though there are minor differences. So let's get in and have a closer look at these models on the turntables. Okay, well that completes our look at these new ARD exclusive Concordes made using the Socatec mould. I'm really pleased to be able to finally add all 4 of the British Airways Concorde liveries to my collection. Concorde models are often very hard to find, especially that really good Herpa mould. And this one, this Socatec mould, is only marginally inferior, I think, at the landing gear. Otherwise, it's effectively identical. So these are a really good set of releases, and you don't want to miss out on these because they're going to be hard to find again in coming years. Much like that BAE Landor is a really holy grail for many people, the old Gemini version. This one's much nicer. So these are a really nice selection of Concordes. I'm really pleased to see these getting released, albeit they're not particularly cheap. I think they were £49.95 each, so that's pretty expensive. But still, you get what you pay for, and these are really nice models. Thanks very much for watching, everyone. Hope you've enjoyed this look at Concordes in 400 scale. Don't forget to keep on checking out what's coming to the channel, because there's new content being released every week, 2 or 3 vids. So keep an eye out for that. But that's it for now. Thanks very much. I'll see you next time. Goodbye from Yesterday's Airlines.